let's begin. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Christina Vasari for inviting me to participate in the SDUIS initiative in sports psychology. It's an honor for me to be here. And if any of you are interested in studying sports psychology, I would highly recommend SDUIS. That's where I studied, and it's really influenced my career in a very great way. I would like to make this as interactive as possible, so clearly you can text in the chat box if you have a question. I have no problem if you'd like to just turn your mic on and ask a question as well. I'd like for this to be as interactive as possible. My background is in clinical and counseling psychology and in performance and sports psychology. I'm mostly known for my work in sports and particularly in golf, as I spent about 3 years on the Golf Channel. I am the sports psychologist to Michael Breed, who was on the Golf Channel, and I'm the consulting sports psychologist to Rutgers men's golf team. For those of you who don't know my background, what's going to be on the screen right now are some of the activities I've been involved with. In addition to what's on here regarding sports, I'm also a performance psychologist for global companies, working with Fortune 500 companies. And my responsibility as a performance psychologist is to help with talent acquisition, so hiring, succession planning, corporate cultural development, and team building. And my approach is not as an executive coach, it's as a performance psychological coach. For those of you who don't understand that just yet, hopefully you'll see some of the things I've been working on. Fear is frequently experienced. People don't really know the difference between anxiety and fear. Anxiety is not knowing what could happen or creating a disproportionate probability of an event taking place. Fear is actually reality-based. So if there was a fire in a room, I'm sure we would all try to get out of it. If you were to worry that a fire was going to occur, that would be an example of anxiety. Pretty interesting statistics, and the reason we're beginning with this is that probably not aware that you have 80,000 thoughts a day, so between 2,500 to 3,000 thoughts an hour. If you're an athlete or a business individual, and if you have some degree of discomfort or anxiety, it may significantly interfere with those number of thoughts. And the research has told us it's about 60 to 70% of your thoughts if you're anxious. Clear if a person's depressed, it may even be more intense than that. I'll ask you the question now, what do you frequently think about? And you might not even be aware of what you're thinking. So 3,000 thoughts a day, I'm sure you're not aware of every thought that you're having. The human span of concentration is only 10 minutes. Try to go 10 minutes without having an intrusive thought or a compulsive thought where you think about something and over again, which is called a rumination. I think you can see that what you're thinking about, how you're thinking, will profoundly influence your performance. Part of what we're going to do today is what's called metacognition, which is to get you to think about your thinking. Most people don't even think about what they're thinking. Thinking is like breathing. You breathe rhythmically most of the time, and when you're playing sports, you will increase your rate of respirations. But the interesting thing about thinking is that you can do diaphragmatic breathing just below your rib cage. You can do thoracic breathing, which is up in your chest area. If you're exercising, it's there. Now, you can hold your breath. And just like you can hold your breath, you can do the same thing with your thinking. So part of what we're going to try to do today is get you to think differently, or at least look at factors that might influence your decision-making of your conscious thoughts. We make thousands of decisions a day. You're probably not even aware of all the decisions that you're making, but thousands of decisions a day. Start off with a kind of a routine question for sports. What's the percentage of time that an athlete performs at their highest level? It's only 10 to 15% of the time. So you can imagine what it's like for an Olympic athlete, where for those 2 weeks or so, that they're performing at the highest level of their performance probably ever in their life. And to find out that a person can do that, or a team can do that for 2 weeks in a sustained way, is pretty impactful. Does Tom Brady throw the football any differently on the first play of the game compared to the last play of the game down the sideline? I don't think he throws it any differently. His brain's not aware that he's throwing it any differently. His mind might become aware if he starts to perform under pressure in a way where pressure actually influences performance. Talking about pressure for a moment, there's a controversy about whether or not pressure actually exists. We can say, well, time will produce the pressure. Yes, it will. But you may have to get the play off in time, but your performance is actually really no different unless you let pressure affect you. And one of the ways that pressure will affect you is the way in which you think about it. So the way in which you go into the game, or the way in which you go into the boardroom and go through your life, pressure frequently is self-induced. Why do high performers perform at a higher level when under pressure? Well, the reason for that is typically high performance athletes perform better under pressure because actually their focus narrows down to what they actually have to do. So if you're competing against an opponent, if you have to make a decision that's going to influence many people, if that pressure increases, you may actually see that you perform better under pressure. Some athletes perform much better under pressure than when they don't. That's what happens in the Olympics. As the pressure goes up in your competition, if you perform well under pressure, you will exceed your usual degree of potential. No one actually knows what their potentials are, whether it's sport, academics, or business, unless you push yourself to the point at which you fail. If you're failing because time has run out and you haven't executed effectively, then your pressure, or your performance rather, is affected by the fact that time has run out. If you've used all of your abilities and time has run out, and to me, then you've exceeded your highest level of performance to the optimal. So those of you who are trying to perform at a higher level, it's important about the mindset that you're going to have about performing under pressure. Why is sport important in developing decision-making skills in academics and business? I don't know if you've ever thought of that. Some of you may be athletes, some of you may be coaches, some of you may be parents or teachers. The reason that sport is so important is, first of all, sport is the only fair level of competition. In academics, it's not equal. If you have a different teacher who's trying to test your abilities by giving you a different type of test, you'll notice that your performance may be different because it may be more of a subjective evaluation. But in sport, the size of the field's the same, the distance that you're running, the clock is running. So it's only the only true form of competition. I hope you take that into consideration when you look at how competitive you are. Competitiveness can be inborn and you can develop it. And as I say, it will be influenced by who you're competing against. Now, I want you to study this image. Some of you have had this experience before. If you have, we're going to talk about it in a little different way. So identify what it is that you see. And most of you are going to see a square here. And most of you will see the square on top of the circles. And some of you will not see the square or not see the square on top of the circles. And some of you will see these as what people might identify as Pac-Man or Mickey Mouse ears. There's no square there. There was never a square there. Now, the reason I'm using this is for several. One is that it's a metaphor for what truth is. What you see is not necessarily what you get. But if you've made a decision, since you've made the decision, how did you formulate that decision? This is an important piece of what we describe as metacognition, thinking about your thinking. So first of all, since it's two-dimensional, the square cannot be on top of the circles. The white space surrounding the three-quarter circles is what's called contiguous. Now, if you were to analyze your thinking and understand that it's two-dimensional, therefore, the square cannot possibly be on top of the circles, then you would understand that your decision-making process now that you understand to look for factors in how you make decisions, analyzing this. Did you think that this was only two-dimensional? Or did you rush in and make the judgment immediately that it's a square? From this little exercise, you can start to understand how you might make decisions. You might make decisions expeditiously. You might have a sense of pressure to make the decision as quickly as possible. That would be a very different analysis of what's going on. Let me just check the chat here. The percentage of time that an athlete spends at their highest level is 10 to 15%. Thank you for your question. So the point I'm making here is that we want you to become aware throughout the rest of the exercises is how you're actually thinking before you make your decision. Have you gathered all the information before you've done so? And if not, you may be able to learn a little bit more about slowing the process down or by continuously assessing, is there another way to look at it? The other reason I'm using this as an example is because of what's called attentional shifting. Now, before when I was talking a little bit about why sports important, sports help with what's called executive functioning. Executive functioning in a situation when you're playing an open sport where someone's trying to stop you from scoring or interfere with your performance versus a closed sport, which as a golfer, you start the play. And you don't have to worry about what the other person is going to try to do. So in open sports, where your decision-making is occurring rapidly and shifting your attention, the ability to stop that impulse is part of executive decision-making. I think you could understand that that could be very important in decision-making, certainly in the corporate world. So as I present the other three-quarter circles, try to only focus on this one without seeing the square. You may have started to see the square just before the fourth three-quarter circle was presented. You may still be able to only see that one three-quarter circle. If you're able to sustain your attention, or even now shift your attention from being able to see the box to see the four three-quarter circles just planted on the white space, that tells us a little bit about your ability to shift your attention, the speed with which you do so. The question is, why do high performers perform at a higher level when under pressure? One of the things that high performers do when they're under pressure is that they actually start to narrow their focus. That's one of the reasons why they do so much better. Which letter does not belong? Now, before you answer the question, study the image and see if you can come up with a way to understand which letter does not belong. Many people report that the Q does not belong. And when I ask them why, they'll say, well, there's more of a curve here. There's not as many flat aspects on the Q as there are with the K and the M. I don't know how many of you saw the letter T. And if you think about your thinking, you may have thought outside the box or become more kind of intuitive, that you know that you have to have another answer than what's obvious. I don't know how you arrived at that, but you arrived at that in some fashion. Okay. Now, when you're making a decision, there is an intention, there is a purpose for what you're doing. You've read a paragraph, and I'm sure all of you have had the experience after reading a paragraph, you don't remember what you've read. If you now look at how you're reading, which is in metacognition, you might say to yourself, what are the two most important points of this paragraph? How does this paragraph relate to the paragraph before? Now, when you're doing that, you're actually thinking about your thinking, which is going to help you make a different decision. You may have believed that you decided to read the paragraph and understand it. That may have been in your intention. But was that intention enough to direct your attention to finally make a decision of trying to figure out what you've read? So in this model, which is what I've constructed, is that your intention leads your attention to where it needs to be. It's extremely important in your performance as an athlete, as well as it is in making any decision in your life. I'm going to run through this so it would help you understand that there's different levels of processing decisions. So you can know something without understanding it. You can know something and understand it. You can understand that and not believe. Now, why wouldn't you not believe it? What's the process that led you to the decision of not believing it? Maybe you didn't have any facts, or maybe you don't believe what the facts are. You can either believe things that are not true or believe things that are true. I think that there's a decision-making process occurring there as well. You can either decide to value something or not value it. Values are a very intricate process. But if you pay attention, do I value this or not? You might make a different decision. And then you can actually make the decision, am I going to apply what I've learned or not apply it? You can see that there are decision-making processes that are occurring all along this line of congruence. You might not have been aware of it, but that's the way it is. When I want to know what a person actually believes, I always watch what they do. Patterns of behavior will tell us what the truth is. You can see how then we can figure out how a person arrives at a decision. This is the way terrorists are profiled. They look at their patterns of behavior and go back to the belief system, and as a result of that, start to predict what a terrorist would do. Are there any questions up to this point? Who's more intuitive, a fighter pilot or a fireman? What's your answer, and how did you arrive at it? Most people report a fighter pilot. The reality is that it's a fireman. And the reason that that's the case is because of the system that fighter pilots use, which is called the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, and act. So if you notice this loop, it's never ending. It continues to go around and around and around. If you've made a decision, you have to go back and start to observe something over and over and over again. A fighter pilot cannot afford to have a memory of their last combat mission, because if they do, and they're using that information in a heartbeat, things will change. So although it appears that the fighter pilot may be intuitive, which we haven't even defined yet, in reality it's a fireman. One of the things that firemen can do is gather a ton of information. They've used it from their past experiences. And in spite of the fact that the book might tell them this is the way they should make the decision, firemen are more intuitive, or probably the most intuitive group of professionals, because they have to be able to react very quickly. Now, it's not the same kind of reaction only that occurs in sport. Of course, in fighting fires, some of that will be a very reactive process. But the chief has to be able to make a decision. And part of what he's using at times is his intuition. This is an example of typical decision-making by business individuals. You can just kind of read through this. And for the most part, you won't see that a lot of what's occurring here is the use of intuition, except for very high-performing business individuals. And those individuals use their intuition probably more frequently than most people would imagine. What is intuition? How would you define it? Take a moment and assess when you've been intuitive. if you've ever been intuitive. Now, I want to differentiate between intuition and gut responses. Gut responses are visceral, they're not cognitive. And what that means is that if you're using a gut response, people use them interchangeably and it's an error. In a gut response, there's actually a physiological response that's occurring in your stomach. Your stomach has serotonin in it. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that occurs in the brain. But when it's occurring viscerally, it's actually giving you an emotional response. Do we want to make responses based upon our emotions? Many people do. Frequently, your feelings aren't telling you the truth. And frequently, your beliefs aren't telling you the truth. So we have to be able to assess the difference between those two things. Environment is too predictable. How do you separate those two by implicit memory? I'm not sure if the question is hard to separate. Yes, it is hard to separate until you learn the difference. Intuition, a simple definition of intuition, and this is the way I've decided to describe it, is knowing without knowing what you know. Now, people are said to be either intuitive or not intuitive. People said that you can't develop intuition. That's also not true. You can develop intuition. You have to mitigate from other factors like emotions interfering with your decision making. So intuition is a cognitive process, and most people don't know that. So it's evaluating information without your awareness. Most of what you do is subconscious. You will see that a lot of your decisions are made that way. Is that always intuition? It's not the same thing, because in intuition, you're able to gather information without your awareness and put it together in a very effective way. We've actually discussed that it's not a gut response. Intuition can be developed. That would take me many hours of webinar to explain to you how it works and how we can actually develop it. Intuition is overlooking relational and nonlinear things and being able to synthesize information and to do it with divergent process. Divergent means things that are, you have more than one opinion about things. This is very linear, and it's very detailed oriented. Sorry, is there a question? Thank you. So this is a little more information about intuition. Think about when you use your intuition. Intuition is not system 1 or system 2 thinking, either or, black or white. It is a sensory stimulus in the brain. It is not occurring in the gut. You have a model of thinking which you're not really aware of until you ask yourself, how did you formulate your opinion? So part of what happens in metacognition is to make sure that you're understanding how you're actually thinking. You can train to think differently. And that process is called critical thinking. If you haven't had the experience with critical thinking or learned about it, I would highly recommend that you do it. No matter what the reason is that you're here today, as a coach, as an athlete, as a student, make sure you learn about how to think differently. Now you can see that if we take a look at any one of these pieces of information, this may be how you make a decision. Affect, emotion, decision-making of rational disputing, subconscious mental processing, which comes as close to it, experiences, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, or values. Do you think of your values as being intuitive? You think of your values as driving you to make decisions. It's difficult to understand and interpret when a process is intuitive. And one of the reasons for it is because you can't identify, there's a lack of awareness of what's actually occurring when you're making that decision. It is kind of transient. It's obscure. You can't get your hands on it. And that's why many people don't rely on it. But if you're intuitive, and some people are intuitive only in certain areas, we'll explain that in a little while. Some people are more generally intuitive. So the process of intuition can be very defined in one area and maybe not exist in another, or maybe not have been trained. I'm showing you a model of a very sophisticated test. The test is the cognitive processing profile. It comes out of a study that's been done in South Africa, and I've been through the training. It's a very, very powerful tool. It takes about 4 hours to do the test, and it's only administered one-on-one. We use it with very high-level performers, particularly when I do assessments for high-level CEOs or succession planning, people that are going to be the next leaders in the corporation, because we want to know how they think. Now, what you can find here is that down at the lower end, it's called operational thinking. And up at the highest level, it's strategic thinking. And there are 5 different levels of thinking, from something pure operational to something pure strategic. What we found in the testing is we could see where a person is comfortable with their thinking and what we think that their potential is. My scores are up here. I do have a level of intuition, but sadly to have been defined that my intuition is only in psychological matters. I'm very intuitive when it comes to psychological processes. I can't find my way out of New York City. So in spite of the fact that I've been there a number of times, I don't use the process of intuition of figuring my way out. I could probably train myself to do that by gathering more experiences and becoming aware of how I'm gathering the information. I had a very bad experience in New York City when I was a young man, and I think it's inhibited my ability to gather information and use it effectively. So it's very interesting to see that pure strategy exists up here. Is there a large population of people that are purely strategic thinking? Now, each one of these areas subsumes the lower levels of thinking. So if you're up here, you can easily do this, but if you're down here, you cannot easily do that. Intuition is a very, very powerful force in making decisions. This is an assessment summary, which was done on, I think, 33,000 C-suite executives in the world, in English-speaking countries. And what you can see is that the majority of leaders fall down here, and a very small percentage fall up here. And you can see there's only 1% of people that are at high levels performance where they're actually doing strategic thinking. The name of the test is the Cognitive Processing Profile, CPP, and it was developed by Cognidev in South Africa. Some people say they don't have much intuition. Is there something that can be learned? Intuition can be trained. So first of all, you cannot do anything you don't have the potential to do, right? No one's ever going to run a mile in a second. The problem is people don't know how much potential they have. And the only time you can assess what potential you have is being put in a situation where you're pushed to the limits to see how much more you have. So the answer is that we can assess whether or not you have potential to be intuitive. And then, as I say, it would just take too long to describe how to develop that. This is an example of C-suite. So chief executive officer, chief financial officer, chief operational officer, chief intelligence officer, and chief technology officer. Now you can see that we can actually divide each one of their skills of thinking that's essential in their decision making. Interestingly enough, the chief technological officers are performing at a higher level in logical reasoning than even CEOs. CEOs have different responsibilities. So you can see that when we do the assessment, we're going to tailor the information to help us understand whether or not these individuals are in the best position when we make our recommendations in talent acquisition. We're about halfway through already. See if there's any other questions here. Now, the test that I use is the test of interpersonal style, which was developed by Dr. Nidifer. And Dr. Nidifer, who presented last week, I don't think he's presenting today. Dr. Nidifer, I was fortunate to be trained by him. And the test of attentional interpersonal style is not an IQ test. And most people believe that IQ is the best predictor of high-level performance. It is actually a very poor predictor of academic performance. The best predictor of academic performance is grit. Grit is the ability to continue on and persevere under pressure. People describe that as mental toughness. But one of the most important factors in grit is that you have a low need for positive reinforcement. Those people who need a lot of positive reinforcement tend to give up very quickly. IQ is not a good evaluator of performance under pressure in decision-making. Intelligence is important, but it's not the best predictor. The test of attentional interpersonal style is not a personality test. It doesn't generalize comments about an individual. It's very, very specific. It measures 20 mental skills, and those mental skills are essential in effective decision-making. These are some of the areas of the test of attentional interpersonal style. I think everybody would agree that your awareness is essential in making decisions. If you're not aware, how can you make an effective decision? Most people would think, now these scores are CEO scores. Most people would say, why would a CEO have a high degree of external distractibility? Because they have to sense what's going on in all of their responsibilities. They can't afford to be micromanaging. They can't afford to be focused in a singular way. Now, an accountant, an attorney, an engineer may need to do that, but someone who's in a position of being responsible for a large number of things has to be able to be distracted. If you're driving your car down an area where there's either a lot of animals or a lot of pedestrians, you want to make sure that you are able to be distracted, but you don't tell yourself that. There is a subconscious process that alerts you to become aware of things that's not usual. A child on the corner of a street who starts to step out, you don't have to tell yourself to be ready for that. Maybe you do when you start to drive. But what's happening here is that the ability to be distracted when you need to be distracted is something that you've learned over time and you've lost consciousness about it. Analysis is obviously a very high order process of decision making. So we can see that CEOs have to have a very high level of that. So without going through all of these, it's just to help you understand that when I'm making a decision about either coaching an athlete or coaching an executive or helping make a decision about the next global president of a Fortune 500 company, let's say in finance, we have to be able to assess these levels of thinking, the processes that they're using effectively. Any questions so far? Let me give you an example of an outlier of an individual that I work with. This individual is responsible in a global way for investments for a very, very high-performing financial house in the world. Now, when I looked over his score was a 35. Now, that didn't make a lot of sense for a person who's going to be making decisions on how to earn millions of dollars, or perhaps even billions of dollars. Why would his awareness score be so low? So when I spoke with him in the interview, and I found out in his background that he was trained as a physician first, he's an MD, in an emergency room. Now, what he told me about his decision-making was that he was going to rule out all the things that were not necessary and only look for very specific points. He didn't need all that data. It was a very interesting piece of information where you wouldn't have understood that a very low score here would predict his high level of performance until we started to analyze how he decided to do that. So as an emergency room physician, he rules out a number of things immediately and narrows his focus down very, very quickly in order to rule in or to rule out to make that decision. He's using that process in investing as well. So hopefully you can see that decision making will vary among the responsibilities that the person has, so we can make a better decision about whether or not that person should be in that position or not. The question was about a trader. Yes, very similar to a trader, because there's very specific parameters around how traders make decisions. Absolutely. These are some examples of what I was highlighting: risk-taking. So that individual that I just referenced was low at risk-taking because he was making very, very specific judgments. And same thing with the trader. So you would expect them to be very high risk oriented. The risk-taking occurs very quickly, so their decision-making speed is different than other people. An attorney, an engineer don't have to make decisions quickly. The traders do. So you can see that when we're looking at decision-making processes, those are the ways we come to our conclusions. Any questions? This is a model that's been designed by Dr. Nidafer. And what Dr. Nidafer said, there's an external focus, attention that's outside of you, and an internal focus, information that's inside of you. Either the attention is very broad externally or very narrow externally. Your internal attention is either very broad or very narrow. Now, if we were to look at this in terms of sport, a number of sports are played up here. So let's take a look at soccer. Your attention is very broad, then very narrow, then very broad and very narrow, and you're shifting your attention very quickly. So in that first little example that I gave you of attentional shifting, do you stay focused on one thing? Can you shift your attention and pick up other data? So in sports that are open sports, where someone's trying to stop you, this occurs very quickly. Now, in lacrosse, that's not the case. Because in lacrosse, you have to evaluate. You're gathering a lot of information, but what lacrosse players do is actually bring information here, and then a play might be called. And then their attention might go back outside, and then they might execute very quickly up here. Or they might analyze the play, make a decision, narrow their attention down, and then finally execute. Business, if it's not something that has to happen very quickly, gather the information, bring the information in, narrow your attention down, and execute. All performance is based upon eventually narrow external attention, whether you're on the telephone or you're trading, or if you're an engineer and you finally execute, this is finally the outcome occurs in this box over here. Now you'll notice that you cannot get to this box from here. If you're gathering the information and you're considering options and you haven't made your decision, you'll execute. And if you execute prematurely, you're going to make an error in your decision making. So when I'm evaluating individuals for high-level performance, athletes as an example, we need to make sure that they have narrowed their attention down. People that are too impulsive may make that decision too quickly. We want them to make the decision quickly enough, but not too quickly. That's part of how we do the analysis, and that's part of how we do the training as well. But that also depends on the type of trading and risk, low risk. Yes, their speed of decision making, risk taking is certainly going to be contingent upon that. The name of the test is the Test of Attentional and Interpersonal Style, TAIS, and the author is Dr. Robert Nidafer, who has done some teaching at STUIS. Now, this is my model. So this is where Dr. Nidafer's model starts, and this is where I begin. I begin at looking values and personality factors that's going to influence your intention. So when we look at what intention is, like in your value system, which we're going to explore a little bit of, don't you think your values will affect your intention? So if we look at prejudice, don't you think that those values would influence your intention? Don't you think your personality factors? So if you're a high risk oriented person, and if your values are in a very specific place, that will affect your intention, which will eventually start your attention. And now we start to use Dr. Nidafer's model. So I begin here, looking at personality factors and value factors, and use that as a way to understand more about a person's intention. Are there any questions to this point? We're about 3/4 of the way through. I don't know about you, but this is flying by. Thank you for your comment. Is there any research on what? On what I've shown you or Nidafer's model? If it's Nidafer's model, there's a ton of research. I'm a practitioner, so I apply what it is that I know. And so far, I've been very accurate. Nidafer's model has been studied quite a bit. So if you go online and look up TAIS in business and sport, you'll see all the research that's been done by Dr. Nidafer. Now, most people don't know this test. Those of you who might be in business, most people don't know this test because the only way that you can receive the information from the test is someone who's trained in it. You can't take the test and just get the report. So all the individuals that are disseminating the information have been highly trained. So you just can't go on. I'm sorry?
That's it. No.
I'm sorry? Was there a question? This is an example of the test. It's an actual case study. There's an individual I worked with in 2016 when I evaluated him at first. And then in 2017, we evaluated him again. Now, in between this period of time, he received performance coaching from me. One of the things that you can see is that he's no longer overly distracted externally. Very high level performer, responsible for millions of dollars. And what we're able to do is to teach him how to modify being distracted, overly distracted. We can see that his internal distractibility, he's very critical of himself, he talks to himself, he still was doing that, but it hasn't interfered with his performance as much as it did before. But look what happened to his focus. He's now able to narrow his focus down to where it needs to be. And we can see that over a period of time of his training, his anxiety score dropped remarkably, and his distractibility score dropped remarkably as well from performance coaching. This is an example when we took some data and we were working with the top 16 performers in the world in this company. Now, this measures extroversion, introversion. Well, how does extroversion and introversion affect your decision making? People that are highly extroverted and then are low introversions want to please people. So this is an example of an individual who has high extroversion, introversion. This is a high introversion and lower extroversion. High extroversion, lower introversion. People that are more highly extroverted and have low introversion scores, introversion psychologically is not about how social you are. Introversion psychologically is how self-reliant you are. We want people that have a good balance of extroversion, wanting to make sure that people listen to them, that they're listening to, and people know that they're listening to them, but not overly people-pleasing. So you can see that there's a divergence. Here's a person who's high extrovert and high introversion. So he's going to appear like he's listening to people, and he really isn't. It appears that he's going to listen to people because of a high extroversion score, but a very high introversion score may mean that he's not really going to listen. He's going to make a decision without really regarding what other people are saying. I think you can see just from a simple explanation, and this is on the test of potential and personal style. I didn't mean to imply that Dr. Nidafer wasn't interested in some personality dynamics. This is an interpersonal response, how people are relating to others. So you can see that decision-making could easily be affected by personality factors and how you relate to others. This is the composite of the entire team. So I was able to help the leader see who we needed to work with in this regard. Attentional shifting. Give one more example in intentional shifting. If you are a soccer player and you need to narrow your attention down to make sure, or a lacrosse player, that the cutter is coming across, you need to be able to shift your attention immediately from what's going on in a very broad way to a very narrow way to make sure you're going to either pass the ball or kick it in the goal. So attentional shifting occurs. We want it to occur very quickly. We don't want that to occur very quickly if you're externally distracted and your job requires that you become very focused. A good example of that would be an engineer. A good example of that may even be an attorney. Values and personality. We will talk a little bit about some values in a few moments. This is an example of a leader of the company has 55,000 employees in it. And this individual is responsible for North America. Now, what we find here is that he has very low external distractibility, which means he does not have an open door policy to allow people to come into him to share their opinion. I don't know, is that such a good thing to have? He's a very highly controlling individual. He has a very strong need to be in control. His decision-making speed is very slow, and he's very critical of others. So just imagine that individual when I start to show you who he's working with. All fictitious names, of course. This person is a highly angry person. He's up against his supervisor or the leader of that group, who is highly controlling. How do you think that they're going to interact? He has very low extroversion. He's not a very social person, and he's very angry, and he's very critical of himself. So his metacognition, his thinking all the time, is about how well he has to perform. Don't you think he might lose sight of actually his performance? But imagine now he's interacting with the person before this. Another person on that team who doesn't speak up very much, but has high anger and is very risky. Now imagine the first person who has to deal with a person who's not communicating very effectively, who's also pretty frustrated or angry and takes a great deal of risks. Would the decision-making of the leader react differently because of these components? So you can see now in leadership, we need to know not only the person who's the leader, but their ability to interact with other people. I'll just produce this for a few moments to talk about decision-making. This is an example of a brain that's under stress, frustration, anger, overanalysis, anxiety. The brain will heat up. The very first thing that goes away is analysis. Analysis important to decision-making. If you're angry, if you're frustrated, if you're overly anxious, if you're overly analytical, you won't perform at a high level. This is actually of an athlete. The right side of the brain is where the anxiety is taking place. You won't be able to perform at a very high level. Now, for athletes, when that occurs, you tense up opposite groups of muscles. Muscles you're supposed to relax won't be relaxing. So the tense muscles and the muscles that are supposed to be relaxing are firing at the same time. It will depreciate your ability for speed, agility, power, and strength. I'll stop here to see if there's any other questions. Yes, there's a lot of, Julian, there's a lot of abilities, a lot of qualities to change your overanalysis. You should focus on the execution. What does your body feel like when you're at an impact? Try to sense that in your body. You'll shift your attention from trying to analyze immediately to execution, and that should make a big difference. Earlier that he spoke about is low external distractibility. Yes, which means that he's not going to have an open door policy. So people that person who doesn't speak up very much, with a person who's a closed door policy, he's not going to know very much about what that person is doing. The reason I brought this up very quickly is to Look at Carol Dweck's Growth Minded. If you haven't read Mindset by Carol Dweck, I'd urge you to read that book, and Grit by Dr. Angela Duckworth. Now, this is an example. This was by a psychologist who was actually was a business individual who asked the question, who do you want to be during COVID? People with a fear process of thinking will be very restricted versus a person who has a growth mindset. There's been a lot of innovations as a result of what's been going on with the coronavirus. Companies that were manufacturing cars or perfumes were retooling, and they had to figure out a way to retool their equipment in order to produce, face masks or face shields. This was growth minded. People were thinking outside of the box. They were not allowing their fear to influence them. Book titles again are Grit by Dr. Angela Duckworth, and Passion and Perseverance, which was her second book, and Mindset by Carol Dweck. Thank you. We have a few moments. I'm going to run through this very quickly. We're talking about change because decision making requires change in your mind. Now, maturation is essential for some components. You cannot ride a bicycle if you're 2 days old. Coercion will affect change. We're all being affected almost by martial law by being, we have to shelter in place. We have changed our behavior as a result of that. Crisis will predict the change. The problem is you can't predict whether it's positive or negative. Since 9/11, I'm 35 miles from ground zero. Things have changed around here. We are doing things very differently than we did before. You can certainly see that in the airlines. Discomfort, and all these three things are outside of your control. Discomfort will produce change. If you're not allowing yourself to feel too uncomfortable, you might not change. If you are too uncomfortable, you won't change. And then the last one is the act of the will. Those are requisites for change to take place. Do you wake up each morning and ask yourself, should you be honest or loyal? Those are values. And if your values are integrated into your personality, you're not thinking about this every morning. So it's a good example that your values are going to direct you in a very subconscious way. However, every once in a while, you have to make a decision. Would you rescue someone who is being harmed? Would you rescue them based upon your value system? Would you recognize all the potentials that you could actually get in harm's way of? So it's a very interesting process to take a look at how our subconscious mind is affected by our values and our personality process. We only have 5 minutes. I'll take a pause here and see if there's any questions. I hope that you're seeing today that there's so many factors that are going to influence your decision making. If I've accomplished that, I feel very successful. Can you show those change requisites again? I think I can. There they are. Maturation, coercion, crisis, discomfort, and the act of the will. This is a very intricate value system, and it's a spiraling value system, which says that your values can actually change. And at the bottom of the screen, hopefully you can see that it says collectivistic and individualistic. This starts right above Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So if your basic needs are met, this is how values seem to develop. So you can start with a sense of having to belong to become more independent. And as you spiral upwards, up until you get to the highest level of what's called transcendence. This is the highest level of value systems. Now, the value systems can be evaluated. Those of you who are in business, you may have heard of 360s. I don't do off-the-shelf 360s when I work with corporations, when I work with teams. I do 360s based upon the taste data. So if I want to know how a person is interacting with others, whether there's an open door, closed policy, why would I ask them if they're kind to others? So in the basic 360s are different than the ones that I develop. And then after I've done the 360s on a team, we'll give a values assessment to see if there's a bias. Because if there's a values bias, you cannot get an unbiased 360 evaluation. Now, I did the testing. I fall into these two categories here and this one. I'm very performance driven, but these are other qualities that are part of my profile. And the reason I'm bringing that up is we won't have time to go through each one of those. But this is an example of how people might see me. So one of the things that's interesting is that because I'm very humanistic, other people's might, these are my values, but people who reject my values see me this way. Don't you think that would affect their decision making about how I would be able to impact them if I was in a position of leadership? Now imagine being able to do that with a team, a sports team. Imagine being able to do that in recruiting. I recruit for Rutgers men's golf team. And one of the reasons why they're using me is to help them understand who's going to be a team player and what's going to happen in their decision-making under pressure. So you can see that decision-making incorporates a ton of information. And the last thing I'll address is part of what the process requires is understanding. If you're a team member, you have to be able to demonstrate understanding because understanding will aid in a sense of belonging to any team. That's essential in high-level performance as a team. If you're an individual performer, you might not spend a lot of time trying to understand other people. But I'll tell you that it's essential in terms of your bonding. This is a plug for my book. Although it seems to be written for youth sport, it's great for coaches, it's great for parents, it's great for individuals. Many of the things that I spoke about today are in the book, not presented so succinctly. And just want to let you know that. That's an hour. I'll spend another 10 minutes asking questions. And if you'd like to do that by opening up your mics, feel free to do so. That would be fine with me if you did that. If you feel uncomfortable, certainly write in the chat box. I'll be glad to answer those questions as well.
Thank you. Dr. Nick, can I ask you one question about yesterday presentation? You told about spirituality and sport. Could you say something about spirituality and business? It's the same? Could we say something that it's the same for leaders in a business and for athletes in a sport? I mean motivation.
Yes. So I think when you look at spirituality, first of all, you know, we can differentiate between spirituality being religious spirituality, or we can look at spirituality as a process that comes from the essence of the person that guides them into performing at a high level. Don't you think that would affect decision making? So if your belief in human nature is that in a values way, which can be a spiritual basis, right? Would help you encourage people to perform at a different level. So if there was no faith in yourself or faith in something else or faith in other people, that may make a difference. Now, faith is not trust, because trust is based upon proof and faith is not. If you have faith in something that is spiritual that is driving you, you don't have to prove it. Now imagine if you're faced with someone who doesn't have spirituality or doesn't have faith, and you have to interact with them. How would that affect performance? I think that might help you a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions here.
I'm just wondering if I could give some input here. So I am a sports psychologist here in the UK, but I was a trader for 16 years.
Ah, wonderful.
So the trading question that came up, or point that came up, was from me. My name's Shamima. Nice to meet you. I think someone asked the question about risk, and if the lower the risk, was it something to do with the lower the risk, and what was the point they made? I forget now, but what I would like to say is that when you put up the math question, my trader sort of hat went on, and I immediately thought, right, I thought I have to filter out all the noise, and went back to the formula of how you calculate sort of time, distance equals speed over time, times time.
Right.
And took out the formula and did the math question. And then I went to look for, are there any other things that I need to be aware of? And of course there was a stop with an extra 30 minutes. So I added that. So just to give an example of how I went about doing that math problem with my trader mindset. And I think I'd like to make the point is that whilst we may miss things, with our awareness being much lower when I have my trader sort of approach, that is part of the risk that we're willing to take.
Right.
So
that's an interesting concept, process about risk taking. Thank you very much. Yes, you do some risk taking there. Very good. So some other questions. Yes, I do training, and the method of training that I do is what I describe as performance coaching. So I analyze the processes which are either too high or too low, and we give very specific strategies. We also do teamwork in interactive dynamics. I do work with volleyball players, and thank you for your positive comments, by the way. Okay, any other questions?
Hi, Dr. Nick. Thank you again. I was wondering, because when you showed the taste, you had the score the person got, and then you had the norm score. How are those norm scores calculated or created, and do they vary depending on which purpose you're applying the taste for?
Yes, the answer is yes. So, we have norms for golfers, for example. And that's obviously different for a closed sport. So the decision-making speed for a golfer is much slower. The narrowing of the focus is very kind of finite. There's kind of a rigid piece of the way in which they gather information. And the question about high-level performers, are they more intuitive or more analytic? There's not a question in my mind that they're much more analytic. But what they're able to do is to analyze that and shift their attention to their decision making. Now, when they're getting ready to hit the shot, part of what's going to occur there is more kind of an intuitive process. I'd recommend that you try to get a video of Phil Mickelson explaining how he selects the club and how he makes a decision when he's using a 60-degree wedge and all the different things that he does with his grip. You will see that's very highly analytic.
Thank you, Dr. Nick.
My pleasure. Do we have any other questions? Well, thank you kindly for your attention. I hope it gets you to think differently. Good luck.